again, welcome to all of you who are attending tonight. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to those of you who may be watching this video at a future date. I'm sure you'll find tonight's topic informative and I think very vital to your communities. Everyone here today recognizes that community living is probably the fastest growing segment of the housing industry right now. In addition to great lifestyle benefits, which many of you enjoy, HOAs and property managers have an opportunity to significantly influence the ongoing value of their communities. And today our panelists will be discussing community reserve funds, which has a huge influence on the value. Reserve funds are already an integral part of creating and establishing the community's value. As our economy changes and as communities mature, the reserve fund is a key barometer to the property values and the economic value of the community and the organization. So today we'll learn about the reserve funds of the community. We'll explore academic, legal, and practical angles on the most important aspect of community living. In a moment, I'll introduce our four presenters for this meeting, and I'll pass the controls to each of them. They'll be given about 15 minutes or so to cover the basics about their topic. Feel free during that time to submit any questions you have to me, the moderator, and we'll have a Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentations. And as we mentioned earlier, that will go through the chat window. So first of all, let me introduce Dale Gifford. He'll be our first presenter. Dale serves as Regional Project Manager for Complex Solutions. He's worked in the Utah Community Association industry for the last 12 years, and Dale has prepared over 600 reserve studies in Utah and surrounding areas. Dale will be followed by Ryan Bonham. Ryan is President of Advanced Community Services, ACS. ACS manages more than 90 HOAs across Utah. Ryan is particularly skilled in administration and structure and enjoys helping HOAs establish stability. Brandon Myers will be our next panelist. Brandon is a Utah attorney with Morris Sperry. The firm specializes in Utah Community Association law. His practice focuses on litigation, and he has tremendous litigation experience at both the trial and appellate level. And finally, Brent Bothorpe will be tonight's final panelist. Brent is the founder and CEO of Class 1 Disaster Recovery, a restoration company providing diagnosis, cleanup, and reconstruction after flood, fire, mold, wind, and other disasters. Brent is an industry expert who speaks and teaches nationally. So with that, let's get started with our presentation tonight, and I will turn the presentation over to Dale.
Okay, so as we said, my name is Dale Gifford. I'm a reserve specialist. I'm with Complex Solutions. We perform reserve studies. I'm here locally in Utah, and I have performed a lot of reserve studies. I'm actually at 700 now. So what is a reserve study? A reserve study, it's a budgeting tool. It's a tool for an HOA to use so that they can know how much money to budget for the future so that they can avoid special assessments and other unforeseen expenses in regards to reserve items. A reserve study identifies the common area components that an association is required to repair, replace, or restore, and then gives us a lot more information on the useful life and how much it's going to cost to replace those. So there's three basic types of reserve studies. The level 1 study is a full study with a site inspection. This is typically an association's initial study. A level 2 is a reserve study update with a site inspection. And then a level 3 is a reserve study update with no site inspection. There are two main parts of a reserve study: the physical analysis, in which the physical status of the different reserve components is identified, it's inspected. During this inspection, we evaluate the condition, and then we also are looking at the repair and replacement costs of the different components. The financial analysis portion of the reserve study assesses the association's reserve fund balance, and the association's position in regards to their reserves, whether they have any reserves, whether they don't, whether they're actively budgeting to put money towards reserves, or whether they need to start that in the future. So what is a reserve component? This is a question that comes up a lot. There's 5 basic tests in the industry that you can use to identify if one of your common area components is a reserve component. So the first one is it an association responsibility? If it's not the association responsibility, then you don't have to worry about paying for it, typically. Sometimes you're going to have some funny things going on, but typically. Does it have a limited useful life expectancy? Some things have a very long life, such as utilities, sewers, storm drains, and stuff like that. So those typically don't have what we call limited useful life. Does it have a predictable remaining useful life? So can we identify approximately when it will fail? And there's industry standards for many different components where we can predict this. Again, things like utilities or your water lines, your sewer lines, like your storm drains, they don't have a predictable remaining useful life. Is the component above a minimum threshold cost? So the minimum threshold cost is a cost that it is set by the association. So in some associations they say $500 or $1,000. That's kind of a pretty typical starting point. But there's other associations where they say, you know, we only want to fund things in our reserves that are over $20,000, and everything else we're going to fund out of our operating budget. And then the last one doesn't really come into play in Utah, is as required by local codes. There apparently is some place in the country that might have some codes that require you to have certain components be reserve components. Reserve study contents. The reserve study has several different parts. There's an association summary. There's the financial projections and recommendations. There is the component inventory, a list of sources of information and where it was gathered, how it was gathered, a description of the level of service, whether it's a site level 1, level 2, or level 3. So whether it's a new study with a site inspection, an update with a site inspection, or an update without a site inspection, and then disclosures. So in the association summary, you'll often find things like the number of units, physical description, is it townhome style, is it condominium, is it a single family home community? The financial condition of the reserve fund, is there a reserve fund? How much is in the reserve fund? And the current reserve fund contribution, so is the association currently budgeting to put any money into the reserve fund? The financial projections and recommendations is one of the other sections. In this section, we identify the ideal reserve fund balance. So this is the ideal balance that if you were 100% funded, which is considered ideal funding, this is how much money you would have in your reserve fund. And this is different for every association. Then there's a recommended reserve fund contribution. This is typically expressed in a monthly or a yearly contribution amount. So this is where the reserve provider is telling you, in order to be at the funding level, and we're pushing for full funding, and most reserve providers are doing full funding. So this is telling you how much money you need to save each month or each year to get to that full funding position, that ideal funding of 100%. It also tells you the percent funded. So if you do have money in your reserve fund, where are you? If you're 0 to 30% funded, you're considered to be in a weak financial position. If you're 30 to 70% funded, you're considered to be in a fair financial position. This position has also been considered adequate in other states when they've had lawsuits that involve reserve studies. So some associations' documents talk about adequate reserve funding, and the fair funding level has been considered the adequate level. The strong financial position, which is where we would love everybody to be, and if everybody had the knowledge they would want to be, this is the strongest position and the most likely to avoid special assessments, and other unforeseen expenses. And then the top end, the 100%, is considered ideal. This also lists out projected reserve expenses by year. It's an industry standard where there's a year-by-year projection of what reserve components will be coming up each year that you can expect to have a project for. And then the projected yearly reserve fund balance. So again, this is another breakdown per year where it's going to show you how much money you're putting into reserves, how much money the reserve fund provider thinks you're going to be spending on reserves. Typically, it also includes things like how much interest you should be getting on those reserves and information like that. The component inventory. So the component inventory section, it'll list the component name, so description. It'll also list the quantity. This could be in square feet, linear feet. This could be in number of buildings, just depending on the component. The useful life. So how long, per the industry standards, is this component supposed to last? The remaining useful life. So if it was installed, in 2010 and it's 2014, a certain percentage of the useful life has been used, so to speak. And so we're identifying how much useful life is left to give you an idea of when you're going to need to replace it. And then the current replacement cost. So if you went out today and needed to replace it, what would the current cost be? Other reserve study contents, sources for information. So where did you get your cost estimates? Did you talk to local providers? Are you using cost estimation books? That sort of thing. Again, the description of the level of service. Was there a site inspection or was there not a site inspection? What type of site inspection? Was there any destructive inspecting, etc.? And then the disclosure section. So it lists conflicts of interest, description of the physical analysis methods, what the interest rate, inflation, tax, the preparer's credentials, and other information like that. Okay, so I'm going to skip over these advanced topics. This was going to be available. I'm not sure how it's going to be available. It's going to be available, and so you can read through some of these, and if you have questions, you can ask me. So this is what I want to get to. So we have a reserve study. Now what? So I get this question a lot from associations. They get a reserve study. Typically in the state of Utah, the average association is overwhelmed because unfortunately they're typically underfunded. And so you need to know, what do you do with it? Don't just put it on a shelf. That's definitely what you don't want to do with it. You need to determine what your funding goal is going to be. Do you want to shoot for full funding, 100%? Do you want to shoot for a baseline funding, which is keep it above 0%? That's a lot more risky, and it takes a lot more changing of your reserve contribution. Or do you want a threshold funding of something other than 100%, say 70% or 50% or something else? You just have to decide where you want to be. We always encourage you to shoot for 100. So you just need to make a determination. So, hey, we want to shoot for 100, and we want to shoot for it at the end of a 30-year period, which is the typical time length of a reserve study. Once you have determined that, you want to determine a course of action. Are you going to increase your dues? Are you going to have a special assessment? Are you going to get a loan? How are you going to fund the increase? Are you going to increase the dues slowly for several years? Are you going to do one big chunk at the start? I worked with associations where they've received their reserve study and they say, okay, we want to shoot straight to 100%. And so they do a special assessment and they do shoot straight to 100%. That's typically not what the average association is able to do. The people just are not in the position where that can happen. So a more conservative approach of, increasing a little over a number of years and then keeping up is typically something that works from associations. Create a policy and then adopt it. So you've set a goal, you've determined a course of action, put it in writing. Put it in writing, put it in the minutes of a meeting, adopt it. Put it, don't just have it in your mind, don't just say it. And then the most important part of all of this is communicate that policy to the association and explain to them the need to have this money for future. Who should perform your reserve study? In the state of Utah, I hate to say it, but there is no guideline on who has to perform your study. Technically, anybody can. Of course, I'm biased. I am a professional reserve study provider. I think you should always have one. There's several reasons. We have the experience and the qualifications. We're considered the experts in the industry and are called upon to be expert witnesses for lawsuits. You transfer the risk to that company and to their insurance instead of to your insurance, which you may not even have the right insurance. Your attorney and your insurance providers recommend that you use a professional. We're an unbiased third party, so you may be in one of those associations where people have differing opinions, and so oftentimes it's very nice to have an unbiased third party opinion that you can turn to. And then we also hold the proper insurance coverage. If a lawsuit should arise or something else should happen, we are properly covered. And so that's all the information I have. There's some other information here, information about myself, different information sources that are good if you want to do some further research, and then also my contact information. Please feel free to contact me via email or phone. I'm happy to help. We do free bids proposals, so I'm happy to do a bid proposal. And I thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you very much. And Ryan is our next presenter, so I will pass this presentation to Ryan.
All right, hopefully people can hear me. I don't know if you can or can't, so you hear me. Okay, perfect. All right. So as Spence mentioned at the beginning, my name is Brandon Myers. I'm an attorney with Morris Sperry. I've been with Morris Sperry for about 1.5 years now, and my background is primarily with litigation. And so as I talk tonight, my presentation is going to be about what Utah law requires, what specific statutory requirements there are with respect to reserves. And as my background as a litigator, I typically am looking at risk and trying to help my clients avoid risk and to avoid having to pay me to defend them in a lawsuit. And so throughout the presentation, hopefully I'll give you some pointers to reduce risk and ways that you can deal with reserves and compliance with the statutes to avoid lawsuits and those sort of things. That is no fun for anybody. I want to start with a brief story about reserves that sort of hopefully will illustrate why they're important and why the legislature has decided to get involved and has legislated and is starting to try to force associations into compliance with reserves. And I think there's a good reason for that. There's an association here in Utah that an attorney in my office was involved in this case. I wasn't directly involved, and so this story is secondhand, and certainly I apologize if I get anything wrong as I retell it. But this particular association, it didn't have, for a number of years, it didn't have a reserve analysis conducted. It didn't have a maintenance plan, and it wasn't properly maintaining the building. It also hadn't placed any money away into a reserve to deal with maintenance and repair and replacement issues. This is an actual picture of the association, of the building. You can see that the building was a wood frame structure on top, and then it was a cement underneath. It sat on top of a cement foundation, and there was a underground parking underneath the wood structure. Over time, leaks started to form in the wood structure of the building, and it caused the wood to rot. And as it rotted, it also caused some settling of the structure. And the settling and the rotting became so severe at one point that one of the unit owners could actually sit in the living room of the unit and actually could look from the unit down into the parking garage because there had developed such a gap. At this point, the association decided that they would get somebody out there to see what the repairs would be, and they hired an engineer who came, and the engineer estimated that the cost would be in excess of $1 million. As I mentioned, the association didn't have any reserves, and the excess of $1 million that was necessary to repair it equated to about a special assessment of $30,000 per unit. The units in this building had values of about $150,000, and so the contemplated special assessment was about 20% of the total value of their homes, and obviously that wasn't going to happen. Special assessment wasn't an option for these unit owners. Some unit owners, they tried to get away from this mess by selling their properties and selling them without disclosing the issues that were facing the HOA in terms of the repairs that were needed. And what happened with those sellers is eventually HUD, who the loans that were used to purchase these units were FHA backed, and so HUD sued the owners who had sold the units without the disclosures, because now they were had these assets that they were, or these loans that they were securing by assets that had these. Some owners allowed their units to foreclose just to get out from under the obligation and out from under the unit. And upon the foreclosure, banks, the banks that were foreclosing, realized that they couldn't sell the properties either if they were to make proper disclosures. And so there was a number of issues. The only option for the banks was to hope that all the units would foreclose and they could get together with all the other banks and try to figure out a way to sell the property as a whole to a developer. This was a couple of years ago, and I'm not sure of the status of how it ended up. And of course, this is sort of the nightmare scenario of a perfect storm, and perhaps it wouldn't have been avoidable in any event. But if the HOA had a regular reserve analysis and a maintenance plan and a maintenance schedule and had been setting aside reserve money, the impact could have at least been reduced to some point. I think stories like this is what's driving the legislature to try to regulate reserves and really trying to force associations to comply and to have reserve analysis and also reserve funds. And so there are real impacts to communities and to people when the associations aren't properly reserving. And I think, as Dale mentioned, or perhaps it was Spence at the beginning, but these homes are people's primary assets, and a lack of reserves and a lack of reserve analysis to determine the reserve funds can dramatically affect property values and community, the ability to sell and purchase homes, because lenders won't lend in communities where there's issues with the reserve analysis and the reserve fund. And so it is certainly important, and the legislature is attuned to that. I'm going to talk about now just essentially 8 requirements under Utah law for reserves, and I just want to point out here at the outset that the reserve statutes are found in 2 acts. One is the Condominium Ownership Act, and that's found at Utah Code Annotated 57.8.7.5. The other Act, which is 57-8A-211. The Condominium Ownership Act applies to condominiums and to any other type of association where the declaration has submitted that project to the Condominium Ownership Act. The Community Association Act will govern any other type of a community association that's not a condo act or hasn't been submitted to the Condo Act. Unfortunately for reserves, the statutes are almost identical with respect to reserves in the Community Ownership Act and the Community Association Act. And so as I speak, unless I say otherwise, you can assume that the provisions that I'm talking about apply equally to condominiums or to non-condominium, to other community associations. The first requirement under Utah law is that you actually have a reserve analysis, and it requires that, except as otherwise indicated in the governing documents of an association, that the management committee shall cause a reserve analysis to be conducted no less frequently than every 6 years. The declaration may say otherwise, and if it does, the board should follow what is in the declaration. But otherwise, every 6 years there should be a reserve analysis completed. Dale touched on this a little bit, but a reserve analysis under Utah law, according to the code, is an analysis that determines, 1, the need of a reserve fund to cover the cost of maintaining, replacing, or restoring common areas and facilities that have a useful life of 30 years or less, and that can't be funded just from the general budget of the association. It's not really clear under the law what that means, whether or not it can be funded from the general budget. It's just not clear, and there's no definition for that, and no case law, which I'm aware of, that has defined that requirement. The second part of a reserve analysis is that it determines the actual amount of the reserve fund, how much money needs to be put away to cover these maintenance, replacement, and restoring issues in the association. So that is what the reserve analysis has to include under Utah law, or I guess what it is under the statute. The second question or issue is who can conduct a reserve analysis. And under the statute, actually, there's two categories of who can conduct a reserve analysis. The first is the board, and the second is a reliable person as determined by the board. And so that second category is pretty broad, and again, there's no definition of a reliable person. I'm not aware of any case law that talks about who would be a reliable person or even what the factors would be to determine who that is. So presumably, so long as the board gets together and makes a reasonable judgment and assessment of a person being reliable, whatever that term means, that person can legally conduct the reserve analysis. The more important question, perhaps, in my mind is who should conduct a reserve analysis, and I know that Dale touched on this as well, but I'll just mention a couple of things. Sorry about that. A couple of things on that point. Because the law does allow a board to do the analysis, there's sort of a natural inclination, it seems, to have the board do it, because then the HOA doesn't have to pay an outside person. I've actually spoken with boards that are planning to do their own and have started doing their own reserve study based on this very cost-saving rationale. I think that they quickly find out, however, that it's a lot more complicated than it appears, and it takes a lot of time. And so we advise all of our HOA clients to have a professional performed analysis, preferably it's somebody that has a reserve specialist designation, someone that's met the minimum requirements and is able to prepare both the physical and the fiscal components of the study. And there's a number of reasons for this recommendation. I'm running a little bit short on time, so I won't go into all of them, but as Dale mentioned, there's certainly from my perspective as an attorney, there's a big risk shifting component to having a professional do it. You take the risk off yourself for any issues with it, and you can shift that risk over to the professional. If there are any lawsuits or any issues that come up with respect to the analysis, you've been able to push that off to somebody else, which is always a good thing. The next part of Utah law, the next requirement, is that a board review the reserve analysis every 3 years. So sort of in between that 6-year period, you should have a review and, if necessary, an update. I would recommend that with that review that you also invite a professional back, perhaps the same one that has done your reserve study, to actually conduct that review and the update. The next requirement of Utah law is that the HOA provide the owners with a summary of the most recent reserve analysis or update each year. The statute does not say how that should happen or in what medium it has to be presented. And so it could be in writing sent to the owners, such as through an email. Probably posting it on an HOA website would be fine, and perhaps even just a presentation, a verbal presentation at the annual meeting that summarizes the most recent reserve analysis or update would be acceptable as well. Another requirement that I won't spend a lot of time on is if an owner requests a copy of the reserve study or an update, you're required as a board to provide that to them. You can't withhold that for any reason. Once it's been requested, you need to give them a full copy of the request. The next sort of major area in the statute is funding the reserve fund and budgeting for it. The law requires that an association in every single annual budget include a line item for the amount that the board either determines to be prudent, or if there's a higher amount that's required by the declaration that needs to fund the reserve or budget for the reserve fund in that amount. The statute, it doesn't deal with what is a prudent amount. It doesn't give us a definition of that. I would think that ideally the budget line item would follow the reserve funding plan that's in the reserve analysis, and although there may be reasons why not doing that, it would be prudent and given an HOA's particular circumstances. Ideally, I think that the funding would follow that. One quick note is that there is a provision in the law that allows the owners, within 45 days after the budget's adopted, the owners can vote by a vote of 51% in a special meeting to veto the line item that has been set in the budget. If it's vetoed, the board then has to look back in time to the last time a budget was approved with a line item for reserve fund, and then the board is required to use that number in the budget. If there isn't, if you're looking back in time and there isn't an amount in any prior budget that's been approved, the statute isn't clear, it doesn't say what you do then, and that's certainly an open question that's not resolved. With respect to the reserve fund, it needs to be separated from other funds of the association. Just quickly, I think there's a couple of ways that arguably that could happen. One is on paper in an accounting function where you're identifying the separation of the funds. And the other way, which in my mind as an attorney and trying to advise clients with respect to risk, the better way would be to actually have that physically segregated and have the reserve fund in a separate account that isn't tied in with any of the other money operating funds of the association. It makes things much cleaner, and it avoids any issues with how that money is being spent, which is important because Utah law also restricts the use of the reserve fund. A board can only use the reserve fund for the purpose for which it was established, and specifically it can't use it for daily maintenance, so lawn mowing or plowing snow, whatever it might be. It can't be used for those items unless a majority of owners approve. One issue with the language of the statute is if the reserve fund was established and the board in doing so specifically said that this money is going to be for repairing a driveway or sealing concrete or fixing fences, something to that effect, and then after the fund is established, let's say they have a pipe burst or issues with the roof, well, the money cannot be used for those items because the designation was for and the fund was established for other items. And so I would recommend that when you're establishing your reserve fund that you use general language that leaves you with some flexibility. So something like that the fund is being established for reserve purposes or maintenance and repair purposes. That will leave you with some flexibility. I know I'm out of time, and so I just want to mention really briefly that there is no requirement that an association invest funds, but if you do so, you need to do it prudently. Basically, there is no definition of prudently, but as sort of a rule, if you're investing prudently, you assume that the money is yours, the assets is yours, and you invest them as you would your own money. And you should be sure that your investments of reserve funds are safe and are not overly risky because you want the money to be there and you want it to be liquid. And so types of investment vehicles that I think would be prudent are certificates of deposit, FDIC, insured money markets, United States Treasury bills, notes, and bonds. Finally, beyond the statute, you always need to be aware of what's in your governing documents. I've listed some common terms that you'll find in governing documents with respect to reserves. And you want to make sure that you're aware of what those are and follow those because you do have a legal obligation to follow those provisions as well, so long as they don't conflict with the statute. I think that I have gone over my time, and I apologize for that. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end about risk and some other issues. But for now, I'll pass it back to Dale.
We're going to move on to Brent now. So Brent, I'll pass the presentation off to you just shortly.
So I'm going to take a little bit different tack. It's kind of interesting to hear the other presenters here, though, and see that how similar many of the things are. But knowing that we were going and all presenting on reserve analysis, reserve studies, I wanted to give you a little perspective of some of the things that I see really as a contractor. I'm going to broaden where we are, and the involvement I've had with reserve studies has been from that perspective as a contractor and helping communities look at some of the assets that they have. And the real concept that I want to present is what the title is here, and that is, once we start building these reserves and we have these reserves, we want to really protect those reserves and see that they're used for the purposes that we have there. One of the really neat things I've found on reserves as I started to get familiar with them is that it is one of the most awesome tools that a board has available for managing the assets that they have to manage. And I'm going to share several stories as we go through this with you of communities as they've become aware and being able to use the reserve study and dealing with assets that they were not even aware that were their responsibility until they had a reserve study. But I see in your toolbox of things available, this is being the hammer, just the tool that you're going to constantly, a central tool. I also look at it, just my thought is, I think of a homeowner, not in a community, but an individual homeowner was aware of what a reserve study would do. Homeowners would want reserve studies so they can look at what their expenditures and future expenditures on a home would be. It's just a really cool tool to be able to have available, and I hope that I can share with you a little bit of how awesome that is. If we were able to pick Dale's brain and get all those reserve studies he's done and put them all in a little sieve and feed them out with some data, we would end up with a chart that looks something like the chart that I have here. And this chart represents in the blue, the money that the developer builder initially put in and built this with. And then the green represents really your annual budget, those expenditures that you're doing for routine maintenance and so forth. And over the years, those go up a little bit as the property ages, but hopefully fairly minor. And the first few years, you probably have little to no expense, and any monies that are put out should be going straight and building those reserves. But then as the property ages, the types of repairs and the types of things that are done, the older the property gets, starts to increase. And so this just gives us a little bit of an overview of what just about any reserve analysis. The neat thing is your reserve analysis will give you the very, very specific detail and down to dates of what that is. But I want to simplify this because there's a couple concepts I want to put out, and I'm really going to take this just to some core things in management of what are reserve funds for. If we get rid of what was just shared with us from the legal definition of what we've got to fulfill, and just take it to the most basic thing, what are reserve funds for? And my definition of it, and this is just my lay definition, is that reserve funds are for capital improvement. They're not for damage. They're not for legal bills. They're not for property improvements. They're not for any of that. They're for the capital improvement, the long-term replacement of assets. Really they replace the depreciation, or often calculated on depreciation. One of the neat things that good reserve fund provides for you is this view that you can have of how the monies are divided up between the projects into the future that you have. Now, you just got some legal advice, I think, on not doing this in a literal sense in your rules or covenants, but on an analysis, and in an analysis, you can get all kinds of reports that help you see more specifically how different projects are funded into the future. And a great reserve analysis will provide you a lot of information that way to see how you're going to fund those different things. Then one of the cool things that I've found, and I'm going to share a story with you in a minute about, is that I found many communities have never taken the time to actually sit down and determine what all of the assets that the community has and the board is responsible for. And this reserve analysis is going to do just that. It will help us define those assets of the community and what those are. And one of the things I want you to see, so far both of the other speakers have used the term risk, and I'm going to use the term risk heavily. And risk is a term that we use, and in my industry we're looking at a lot of risk management and risk analysis, but when we're trying to manage and control assets, what we're really trying to do is manage and control risks. And so anytime I use risk or people are using risk, you can kind of interchangeably deal with that on the assets. And so the final thing, and it's already been mentioned, so I'm going to kind of skip over, is that really a reserve analysis, I think, will find more and more into the future helps build property value in the community, both in the literal presentation and the existence of the reserve analysis, as well as the execution of that for maintaining the property. So the question that I really put out is protecting the reserves. What do we do to protect reserves? And the real question is, what is it that consumes reserve monies? And so I'm going to skip the obvious. If we're using reserves to pay for repainting the building or re-roofing the building or doing those capital improvements as needed, that I'm not considering that a consumption. I'm considering that a use. In the literal sense, it's still consuming it. But I'm saying what consumes the reserve monies that is not that type of thing. And I've put 4 major areas. And those 4 major areas are deferred annual maintenance. And that's the type of thing where we've all seen communities do this, and I'm meaning municipalities, but this is true in communities, that we don't maintain the asphalt. And so we don't maintain the asphalt on an annual basis, and it builds up, and after a few years we get to a point that it's just got to be replaced. When if we'd maintained it and used some processes, we'd have been able to maintain that asphalt for years and extended periods of time. Another example is rapid physical depreciation. We have a roof that builds up ice dams or has trees hanging over it or has heat problems, and those aren't addressed, and so we've got a 30-year roof that only lasts us 15 years, and that consumes that. I've seen communities do what I call asset acquisition, and that is we build up this reserve fund for the purposes of capital improvement, but God, it seems like there's a lot of money in there. Sometimes we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we'd really like to put in a new playground, or we'd like some ski lockers, we'd like to build some storage areas, and we do those types of improvements. And you just heard about the legal position that's been put out on that and what's put out there. And then the big one, and that I'm very heavily involved in, is damage claims. I see all kinds of damage situations, some of them covered by insurance and some of them not covered by insurance. And those damage claims and the rules that communities have put out create these scenarios that consume their reserves, and all of a sudden the day comes we need to repaint the building, and our reserves were consumed in other ways. And so I really divide those 2 things into 2 major categories, that the way we manage the asset, the way we manage those risks, and I gave you the tie in it. In many ways it's one and the same, but the risks I'm giving on that, really on that last stage. And so what I think, and the concept that I want to take you to, is that a reserve analysis allows you to get into something that in today's world, that if we went to Harvard or Yale, would be taught in management schools as predictive management. You heard about it as predictive analytics. I've read all kinds of articles on this subject, and it's used heavily in big business. And what I'm telling you is that this becomes something, and I want to simplify a few of the concepts down to really basic things, and that we can go from the chaos and from even reactive management and turn this not only into proactive, but being able to optimally get to this predictive management and really be able to anticipate where things are. And if you look at a reserve study, that's exactly what it does. It predicts the date that we're going to have to deal with these things and where they are. And so in the end, there's the funding is an interesting thing, and the law allows the board to make some determination that way. I look at it, if I bought a home that had just a private dwelling that had a roof that had 5 to 8 years left on its life, and I was going to have to replace that in 5 to 8 years, and I don't save up the money, I'm really setting myself up for a special assessment into the future. And the predictive management allows us to look at, determine how are we going to fund these things. Are we going to do it through special assessment? Are we going to do it through the reserve monies, and we can determine with those assets how those things are funded. Ultimately, if we can run this and use the predictive nature and the value of what we have there, we can completely, through a number of methods, eliminate and as a minimum reduce risks. And let me give you an example. This is a great big example with very large numbers involved in it for a community on South Mountain. The community was built, at this point it's probably 15 years old. When I was initially looked at this was 3 or 4 years ago. But the community had large, I'm talking large, huge retention wall systems. These are literally cliffs to hold the soil back in areas where this community was built. And it was built into the side of the mountain. And I was involved with this community in this reserve study to help determine some of the maintenance and depreciation or life expectancy of some of the assets. In this particular case with this big retention system, I happened to know the developer and I knew him personally enough that I could call him, and I called the developer and talked to him, and he said, "Brent, this was the first thing we put in this development, before the streets, before the sewer, before the homes, very first thing. My big question was, what did it cost you to put it in?" And the answer was over $750,000. Now we've got a community that's been built around this with all that infrastructure and homes and buildings and streets. And if they had to replace it today, it would be 2 to 3 times that. But as a minimum, this is like $1 million asset. They were totally unaware that they were responsible for, and that was an asset that they needed to manage and handle. And to that point in its life, about 10 to 12 years into its life, they had never even given it a second thought. And that reserve study drove them to a point where they have an engineer review it annually. They spend a couple $1,000s. And if you had $1 million asset, do you not think you would spend a couple $1,000s a year to evaluate that asset and see what it is? And the point is that if they hadn't done that, the engineer that we involved at that point of it said that within 5 to 10 years, that wall would be degrading to a point that they would have to replace large sections of it. And so they've been able to change their management and extend the life of that wall by dozens of years by understanding that and being able to be very predictive and proactive about the way that they manage that. And I just wanted you to see the same concept we can take from a great big asset like $1 million wall to little teeny things. We use something in the disaster side of things with communities that we call a property loss information sheet. And the property loss information sheet, here's really a picture of one. So this is just an example of one, but the property loss looks at common occurrences that happen in the community. So if we have water heaters going out, that's a great big huge example of one that's very common out there. But it could be sprinkler line things or problems that happen off the roof or any number of things. And what happens is between the boards changing over time, or property managers changing over time, or those, we lose the ability to see the history of what's happened on the property and predict and deal with that. And this just becomes a way of marrying up with that and being able to take that prediction and deal with that. There are also several tools related to this whole thing on transferring risks, and you heard a little bit about that. I think Dale talked about in terms of how doing a reserve study with a reserves professional transfers risks to them. But there are several of the things regarding the assets that we can transfer risks. The most common you're familiar with is using an insurance policy to transfer risk to insurance carriers. But when I've seen communities do reserve studies and use them, there are a number of risks that are more appropriately transferred to homeowners, and homeowners can buy appropriate levels of insurance and things. And well, I'll get into just a teensy bit of that here quick. And I wanted to give you an example of a third-party risk. And a third party is, there are many things that you may have repairs done on that have warranties on them. That's a third-party transfer. And I've just witnessed an example of that where some communities had some siding, has actually had a class action lawsuit, but the warranty will end up helping the communities repair and deal with issues there. So one of those transfers, there are some ways that homeowners have something that is not very well understood and would take a 10 or 15 minute conversation here alone called on loss assessment coverage. But the point of this is, rather than get in that discussion, is that that becomes a transfer tool that homeowners can deal with both liability issues and property damage issues with some appropriate transfer techniques. I want to give you another one, damage scenarios. I'm going to give you a real simple one. Sprinklers. Almost every community has sprinkler lines that break periodically. It's not a question of whether we're going to have them, it's just a question of when we have one. And those scenarios are often undefined and unclear. What I do know is that when they break, virtually every time, homeowners look back to the association to pay for the bill and to pay for it. And they automatically assume that the association is responsible. And what we found is that associations are very clear about the process and what they are and are not responsible for, and define that scenario, are able to actually reduce their costs involved in that. And so this is an opportunity, and it represents a little way of being able to divide and define specific responsibilities for specific scenarios, certain types of damage. And just as a quick sidebar, we have identified 4 or 5 areas with the insurance laws that are set up in Utah where there are some gaps in coverage, and the sprinkler line one is an example of one that if we set it up right, the homeowners can have appropriate coverage to cover it and the community's not having to deal with it. But if we don't set it up right, all of a sudden the community's having to pay for and pick up all of these scenarios, and we're really consuming our reserve fund. So just about everybody's played the whack-a-mole game where you're trying to deal with these little moles, poking them their heads up and whack them down, and the longer you play, the faster it goes. And we can't control every risk out there. We can't deal with and manage every asset we have to the nth degree. So the question becomes, how do you and what assets do you manage and deal with in that way? And so the answer comes is, here's the little formula that I can give you: risk equals exposure times toxicity. And so a story from right here locally a few years ago, in fact there was a nice article written up last year, I believe, in CAI's magazine. But a community had hired a contractor to replace some roofs. And the contractor got the roof pulled off on one building, and then we had a microburst storm come through. And the microburst storm caused hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage in the building to the units. Well, then that all took place. It turns out the contractor was not appropriately insured, and I don't think appropriately licensed. And so, boom, the contractor's out of the picture, and the community is left holding on to this several $100,000 loss as a result, and having to deal with all of that. And it's really exposure that they've taken on. And again, all of a sudden we're consuming reserves and having to, whether it's to fight a lawsuit or to take care of the damage, we're all of a sudden going down those paths to deal with it. And that's one that had very high exposure and very high toxicity. And so there's really the ultimate process is to manage with qualifications. One of the biggest things that the board can do on this is use a process, whether it's a literal RFP, request for proposal, or just a similar process that uses many of the identified characteristics to help identify that. I watch in my industry that ultimately there are people working within communities that should not be there, that create very high exposure to communities. But the end all of the message that I have for you and what I wanted you to see is that although I've had to be very quick and really give you the summary version of this, a reserve study provides a tool that you can really implement predictive management, and that we can start to predict how and when both these assets are going to need to be replaced, and we can use sister tools that will help us provide predictive management processes to prevent the reserve study or the reserve funds from being consumed for things other than what they're really intended for, those capital improvements that we've identified in the asset list of the reserve study. And I hope this has given you a little look at that, and I hope, if nothing else, that I've given you a little of the benefit of a reserve study in being a real predictive tool, and a tool that you can use to manage a community beyond just the financial information that it provides. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Spence.
Thank you very much to our presenters tonight. Ryan's disconnect, unfortunately, was not able to be repaired, so we'll have Ryan on in one of our next meetings. And I'd like to open it up for our Q&A period right now. I've got a few questions. Is there anyone in the group who has a question you'd like to pose to our panelists? Okay, if not, let me share some information that I have. Got a few questions for the panelists, so hopefully the panelists all have your microphones open if you want to respond to any of these. The first one is, how do you determine what can be spent from reserves and what should be from the operational expenses or operational budget?
This is Dale. I can field that.
Great.
So there are some industry standards sorry, there's a lot of echo, so it's hard to concentrate.
Somebody's got their speakers on their computer, and that's coming through your microphone, so if you'd mute, that would be better. Sounds better already. Thanks.
Okay. So there's some general industry standards that we kind of hit on how to determine what a reserve component is. But ultimately, in the state of Utah, it really comes down to where the board decides they want it to be. So if the board and the community decide that they want a threshold of $200,000 and everything under $200,000 is going to be an operational expense, then that kind of makes it really clear. Typically, though, that's not the norm. So the norm is anything with a useful life of more than 1 year and less than 30 years. So examples of reserve items would be replacing your roofing, painting your siding, seal coating your asphalt, replacing your asphalt, replacing your pool plaster, replacing pool components. And examples of operational expenses would be landscaping, your mowing, yearly asphalt maintenance, repairing potholes, doing any crack sealing, and things of that nature.
Great, thank you, Dale. Let me ask one more time, if you have speakers on your computer, if you would just go to the telephone icon, drop down, and click on the microphone icon in your menu, that will mute your microphone so we don't hear that echo. Second question, what happens when unexpected items come up that the community wants? I think Brent spoke about this earlier. For instance, if we want to add a playground to the common area, can we use reserve funds for this?
I can also field that. This is Dale again.
Great, go ahead, Dale.
So typically, the reserve is there to maintain what is existing. If you are adding something new, then you shouldn't be using reserve funds.
Great. By the way, if anyone has additional questions as we go through this process, please either ask just out loud at this stage of the game or go ahead and send a chat message. Next question, do the reserve provisions in the statutes apply to developer-controlled associations? Brandon, do you want to respond to that one?
Sure, I can address that. It's sort of an interesting question. The statutes actually exclude developer-controlled associations from the reserve requirements that I discussed. But there's a Utah Supreme Court case where the Utah Supreme Court held that developers have an independent fiduciary duty to maintain reserves and to have reserve accounts and reserve funds. And so there's sort of a debate about which controls, whether the statute that exempts the developer's control or whether the Supreme Court's opinion controls, and there's arguments on either side. I can tell you that we recommend to our developer clients that they do follow the reserve statutes, and we do that for a couple of reasons. One is it's the safe legal position, and second, just from a business standpoint, it's good for the developer when they hand over the association to have it in a good fiscal state, and having a good reserve fund, it puts the association in a better fiscal state when it's turned over, and I think that can impact the reputation of the developer, of the builder who sold the homes to the people. And so we recommend to our developer clients that you do. Whether or not they actually apply is somewhat of a debate, though, actually.
Great, thank you very much. Any more comments on that one? Next question, are there potential legal ramifications for not following the statutory requirements for reserves? Brandon, probably once again, you're...
Yeah, I can jump in on that one as well. Yeah, there are a number of legal ramifications that can come. In particular, a recent change to the statute is that the statutes actually have a statutory claim, which is new in the law, and it applies to if a board fails to provide the yearly summary that's required, or provide owners a copy of the reserve study on request, or if the board fails to include a reserve line item in the budget. An owner has a statutory right of action, and the way that process works is the owner provides the board with a notice of noncompliance. The board has 90 days within which to cure the failure, and if the board doesn't cure within the 90 days, the owner can then sue, and it can sue for a couple of things. One, for an injunction, which is basically a court order that will force the board to comply with whatever it's not complying with. Second, it can get damages at a minimum of $500 or up to the actual amount of damages that the noncompliance has caused. And then the kicker, I think, is that the association can recover, the owner, can recover attorney's fees and costs. And what that does is it emboldens people, and certainly emboldens attorneys. If you come to a lawyer with a case, and if the lawyer knows if he prevails on the case, he gets his fees paid by the other side, those are cases that are more likely to come. And so that's built into the statute now, and so there's the risk of the statutory claim. More common law, non-statutory claims, there's certainly claims for breach of fiduciary duty. There's things in the declaration with respect to reserves that you're not following. There's claims for breach of the declaration, breach of contract, all of which come with damages, and breach of fiduciary duty can come with attorney fee awards as well. So there are certainly legal ramifications and risks of lawsuit for not following the reserve requirements in the law and the declaration.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from either presenters or attendees? Any clarifications that you would want to make as presenters?
I think there was, on the chat, it looks like there's a couple of questions there.
It looks like Doug had a question that Dale responded to. Do you want to cover that briefly, okay, Dale?
Yeah, sure. Doug asked what constitutes a review and an update according to the Utah code. Like Brandon was saying before, a lot of it is not clearly defined. So a review honestly can be the board sits down in a meeting and pulls out the report and looks. Yep. Okay. Good to go. Next. Which would be unfortunate because they're not really reviewing it, but that could legally be considered a review, unfortunately. An update is actually updating the information in the report. So updating the remaining useful life of the components, updating the financial position of the association, updating the condition of the components, essentially going through every component and updating it, and then putting out a new report with that new information.
I would actually, if I can just jump in, this is Brandon, I would agree with Dale in terms of those terms aren't defined, it's not clear, and I think what Dale was describing in terms of review, I think I could argue that that's proper under the statute. From, of course, from a risk standpoint and trying to avoid litigation, I think you need to have somebody like Dale come at least once every 3 years and have him sit down and actually do a really good review of the last analysis and an up. I think that you need to. I think that you should do more than just sit down at a board meeting and thumb through it. But that may be sufficient under the statute. It's just not clear.
This is Doug, who asked the original question. And
yes, Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, each year I do an update where I adjust for actual inflation that has occurred because we've had lower than generally projected inflation. So I make adjustments to the entire analysis, in fact. Actually, analysis is performed by Dale. And I do the adjustments each year to take into account this, like I say, especially the actual inflation results. But I'm not updating the useful life information that was produced from the original formal analysis. So am I going too far or not far enough here?
That's a good question. I would just caution you not to worry about updating to what the actual inflation is for that year. I mean, it's a 30-year projection, and a lot can happen in 30 years. And making those little changes each year, I don't want to say it's really wasting your time, but I think it's probably going farther than you need to. We would definitely, classify that as a review, but not as an update, especially not as an update as is defined by, APRA or CAI. And sorry, if people don't know what APRA is, it's the Association for Professional Reserve Analysts. And CAI is the Community Associations Institute.
Yeah, but the statute requires, the statute requires a review or an update.
The statute requires a review, and then, if necessary, I think the language is if necessary, an update. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey, you're welcome.
Thank you all. Thank you all for attending. I'd like to turn a moment to Mindy, if you're still on, Mindy, and give her an opportunity to make a few announcements relative to UCCAI.
Okay, thank you. We'd just like to thank our 2014 Diamond sponsors, who are Morris Ferry, Biles Fotheringham, and Advanced Community Services. We have a couple of final events for the year coming up. On November 6th, we will have our final luncheon for the year, and that will be held at Stonebridge Golf Club. That's the regular place from 11:30 to 1. And that topic will be on proposed rental legislation from the Utah Apartment Association. And there will be kind of a panel discussion and some Q&A and discussion about rental issues that will be presented, and we'll have an opportunity to ask questions. That will be from Mike Ostermiller, who is the lobbyist for the UAA, Utah Apartment Association, and also Paul Smith, who is their executive director, as well as Jason Suker from our own Utah LAC. And again, that's November 6th. And then November 8th is our Essentials of Volunteer Leadership course, which is a great refresher or starter course for board members. And that is Saturday, November 8th from 9 a.m. to 2:20 p.m. at Buckner Company. And that does include a feed, which also includes a good sized manual, 142-page manual. So that will go over things like instilling sense of community among residents, how to hire qualified professionals, and service providers, and management, enforcement, and rules and regulation, and how to read and monitor financial statements. So tune in for those events, look on the website and get registered for those. And we are really glad to have you tonight. So thanks for tuning in to our first webinar.
Thank you to all, and we will see you on the next webinar.